Hey bio fans, Anya here from the Biography Wrap, and today we are going to explore the life of Solomon Northup through the movie 12 Years a Slave, directed by Steve McQueen. The story begins on a farm where new slaves are being instructed on harvesting sugarcane. Solomon starts harvesting the crop along with others. Seeing the blackberry juice on his dinner plate, he comes up with an idea. He tries to make ink with the juice, but is unsuccessful. Inside the slaves' quarter, a female slave makes an advance on him. He doesn't resist her, and she relieves herself, then turns to the other side. He hears sniffles from her side, and his mind wanders off to his old life. Solomon tunes his violin and plays a mellifluous tune for a dance. He goes back home and puts his kids to sleep. Solomon's wife informs him that she has to leave for a few weeks. He gets jealous of sharing her cooking. She departs the next day with his kids, and he goes for a stroll in a park. At the park, Mr. Moon introduces Brown and Hamilton to Solomon Northup. They invite him to play music for their events in Washington and present him with an exorbitant amount of money. Solomon agrees to be a part of their ventures as they reach Washington. They share dinner, and they keep refilling his drinks. Solomon wakes up bound in chains. The movie shows a flashback where Brown and Hamilton ask excuses for his inebriated demeanor and put him to bed. Two men enter Solomon's cell. He informs them that he is a free man from Saratoga. One of the men asks him for his paper, but he doesn't have any. He tells Solomon that he is just a runaway Georgia slave. He gets beaten by a paddle and cries. Solomon talks about Brown and Hamilton to Clemens, another slave, but Clemens shuts him down. He thinks Brown and Hamilton sold him. A lady, Eliza, and her daughter get reunited with their son Randall in the slave pen. The two men tell Eliza to discipline her kids. They uncover them and put them in a boat. Clemens advises Solomon to stay silent. He tells him to stay away from the unwanted attention. Robert, another slave, wants to fight off the crew. He talks to Clemens and Solomon, but Clemens tells him that survival is about keeping their heads down. A slaver wakes up Eliza. He had vile intentions in his mind. He tries to stop the slaver, but gets stabbed instead. Clemens and Robert throw his body into the water, and Clemens declares that he is better off than them. On arriving at the market, Mr. Jonas Ray claims Clemens as his property. Clemens is delighted and runs back to his master. Solomon is shocked at the ordeal and witnesses the cruelties faced by the other slaves. A slaver named Freeman calls for new slaves. Solomon gets slapped by him for not answering Platt. Freeman shows them to customers, and Mr. Ford is interested in Eliza and Platt. Eliza begs him to not separate his family, but Freeman sells her son to another customer and refuses to sell her daughter to Ford. The family gets separated as Ford buys Eliza and Platt. Mr. Ford brings the slaves back to his house. Mrs. Ford tells Eliza that she will forget about her children after some time. The new slaves get introduced to Tibbets and Mr. Chapin. He tells them to start clapping as he sings a song about the consequences of stealing. The slaves start chopping trees for lumber. Mr. Ford reads some quotes from the Bible. Solomon explains his plan to transport the loads through water, but Tibbets thinks he is scheming. Solomon tells them about his experience with water transport and succeeds in showing them. Ford gets impressed by him and gives him a violin as thanks. Eliza keeps crying, so Solomon shouts at her. Solomon tells her to stop wallowing in despair. She compares him to prized livestock. Solomon gets kicked by Tibbets for arguing with him about the clapboards. Mrs. Ford gets rid of Eliza as she keeps crying. Solomon remembers the time when Eliza told her the story to him at the slave pen. Tibbets kicks off the clapboards again, so he and Solomon get into an argument. Tibbets tells him to strip, but he refuses. They get into a fight, and Solomon starts whipping Tibbets. Mr. Chapin rides in to break the fight. Tibbets walks off, and Chapin warns Solomon about escaping. Tibbets brings two men with him and hangs Solomon from a noose. Chapin warns them about killing Solomon, and the two men scurry off. Tibbets gets furious, but Chapin points his gun at him. He humbles and runs away, as Solomon survives by tippy-toeing on the ground. Mr. Ford cuts him down. He brings him to his house and tells him that he is not safe on his plantation. He sold Solomon to Epps, a slave breaker and a hard man. Epps narrates a passage from the Bible, which he manipulates to drive fear into new slaves. He weighs the slaves against the cotton they picked and applauds Patsy for picking over 500 pounds. Solomon and 2 other pickers pick less and get flogged outside. Epps wakes the slaves in the middle of the night and commands them to dance. Patsy starts dancing merrily as Epps stares at her. Mrs. Epps throws a glass bottle at her face, severely injuring her. She tells Epps to sell her, else she will leave him. Epps says he will rid himself of her before Patsy. One day, Mrs. Epps gives Solomon a list of groceries. He looks at it but gets a warning from her to not do it again. On the way, he attempts to run but comes across a hanging. He gets scared to his bones and stops thinking of running as he brings the groceries back. Another day, he runs to Master Shaw's plantation to get back Patsy. Mrs. Shaw tells them that she got her way because she fornicated and pleased her master. He brings Patsy to Epps and tells her to run off. Epps thinks he made an advance on Patsy and chases him around the field. Mrs. Epps breaks up the fight and expresses her disgust at Epps' lust for Patsy. Later that night, Epps walks into the slave quarters and rapes Patsy. Another day of dancing happens when Mrs. Epps bakes some cakes for the slaves. She gets offended by Patsy's looks. She complains to Epps, but he doesn't respond. She slashes her face, and Epps takes Patsy out. At night, Patsy asks Solomon to take her life. Solomon refuses, but Patsy begs for mercy from him. Solomon refuses as it's ungodly, but Patsy says there'll be no hell for him. He pushes her away and lies down. Epps' cotton crop gets plagued with insects, so he lends his slaves to a judge for the season. The movie returns to the first scene again. The judge gets impressed with his skill and tells him he will recommend playing the fiddle at Willard Yarner's anniversary. He plays some fine tunes, but then all the slaves get returned to Epps. He gets them to start picking cotton and measures the weights again. Solomon comes short and gets whipped for it, but Armsby, a white man, doesn't. Back at the quarters, Armsby tends to Solomon's wounds. He tells Solomon about his habit of drinking and how he is trying to be better. Trusting in his words, Solomon asks Armsby to deliver a letter in exchange for his anniversary wages. Armsby agrees, and Solomon starts drafting one. Epps visits him and takes him out. He speaks about letters, and Solomon learns that he was betrayed. Thinking on his feet, he turns on Armsby. He tells him that Armsby falsifies stories to make Epps believe that all of his slaves will run away. He wants an overseer's job and is manipulating Epps for it. Epps believes Solomon, and Solomon burns his letter, along with his hope. A slave collapses and dies from picking cotton, and Solomon buries him. He is overcome with grief when the others sing a song at the funeral. Bass, a hired white man, helps the slave construct a structure. Bass's pro-slavery stance amuses Epps as they argue about it. Solomon listens to their banter with interests. Then, one day, Epps gets furious as Patsy is missing. He rages on the female slaves but gains nothing. Patsy returns from Mr. Shaw's and gets manhandled by Epps. He is infuriated, but Patsy explains that she went to get soap as Mrs. Epps wouldn't give her any. Epps isn't convinced. He tells Treach to strip her down and tie her to the post. Mrs. Epps tells him to whip her, but Epps doesn't have the courage. He tells Solomon to do it and shouts "Plat" repeatedly. Solomon holds the whip and strikes at her slowly. Mrs. Epps tells Epps that Solomon is mocking him with his measly strikes. After being enraged, Epps threatens to shoot himself. Solomon starts striking harder, but then stops. Epps lunges at him, takes the whip, and whips her raw till her flesh sears. Solomon asks Bass about his origin, and he replies Canada. Solomon mentions the places he had been in Canada and tells him of his stories. Solomon begs him to send the letters to his friend in the north, and how great of a deed it would be. Bass confesses that he is afraid, but agrees to write his letters. Bass leaves the next day, as Solomon wonders what will happen. Then one day, while tilling some land, a sheriff calls Solomon as Plat. The sheriff inquires about Solomon's family, past, and real name. As Solomon runs to Mr. Parker, he recognizes him. Epps tries to interfere and shouts empty threats. Solomon embraces Patsy for one last time and leaves with Parker. After 12 years, he gets back home and he apologizes to his family. His daughter introduces her husband and her newborn son, Solomon Northup Stanton. The whole family embraces him, and the movie ends. That's it from the movie 12 Years a Slave. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. Let me know what you think of this truly inspirational story, and make sure to check out the next one.